They didn't leave when you were broken. They left the moment you stopped being. You spent years shrinking yourself, minus making yourself easier to love, quieter to hold, less demanding to keep. And the second you stopped, the second you looked in the mirror and decided, minus, I don't need to beg for this anymore, minus, they panicked. Not because they lost you, because they finally felt you. Here's what no one tells you about avoidant attachment minus. And I mean, the thing that will rewire how you see. Everything that happened to you, it was never your love that pushed them away. It was your need. And the cruelest twist in all of this, the moment you healed that need, minus the moment you became the version of yourself, they always told you to be minus. That is the exact moment they became destabilized. Why? Because your emotional dependency was never a burden to them. It was their power source. Avoidants are not cold people. I need you to sit with that for a moment before we go any further, minus, because the story you've been telling yourself, the one that made the pain manageable, the one that let you sleep at night, was probably built on the idea that they just couldn't feel things the way you do, that they were wired differently, emotionally sealed, born behind glass. That story was easier than the truth. The truth is far more complicated and far more devastating. And the moment you actually understand it, minus, really understand it at a cellular level, minus everything you experience will rearrange itself into a pattern so precise it will take your breath away. Avoidants feel everything. They feel it so intensely, so overwhelmingly, so without any architectural framework to contain it, that somewhere in their early life, minus before they had language for it, before anyone taught them what to do with the size of their own emotions, minus they made a decision. Not a conscious one, not a deliberate one. A survival decision, the kind your nervous system makes when it realizes that needing people leads to pain, and that the safest form of love is the kind you never fully let in. They learned that closeness is a countdown. And from that point forward, every relationship they entered was never really about the other person. It was about managing distance, about staying close enough to feel connected, but far enough to feel safe, about keeping 1 foot inside the door and 1 foot permanently pointed toward the exit, minus, not because they wanted to leave, but because knowing they could was the only thing that made staying possible. Now here is where you enter the picture. When you came into their life, minus with your warmth, your openness, your willingness to love loudly, and without armor, minus something happened in them that they didn't fully understand. You were exactly what they wanted and exactly what they feared simultaneously. A person who felt safe enough to want. A person dangerous enough to actually need. So they did what avoidants always do when something feels too good and too threatening at once. They created a system, and this system, minus this invisible, unspoken, never negotiated architecture, minus required one specific thing from you to function: your need, not your love, not your presence, not your loyalty or your laughter or the particular way you made ordinary Tuesday evenings feel like something worth remembering. Your need. Because when you needed them, minus when you reached for reassurance, when you sent the message asking if everything was okay, when you searched their face after a quiet dinner, trying to decode what the silence meant, minus in those moments, they felt something that their nervous system had been starving for their entire life. They felt safe, not because your pain was comfortable to them, not because they enjoyed your suffering, but because your reaching gave them the one thing an avoidant attachment style is always desperate for: minus distance on demand. You reach, they retreat. You pursue, they breathe. You collapse into need, they expand into space. The equation balanced itself, the system ran perfectly. Your anxiety was their oxygen. Think about what that actually means for a moment. Think about every time you felt like you were too much, minus too emotional, too needy, too intense, asking for too much reassurance that you didn't deserve. Think about every apology you issued for having perfectly human responses to being kept at arm's length. Think about the way you contorted yourself again and again, trying to become a version of yourself that was easier to love, less demanding to hold, more palatable to someone who never fully arrived. You were blaming yourself for a dynamic they required. The withdrawal wasn't punishment. The silence wasn't indifference. Every time they pulled back just as you got close, it wasn't because you did something wrong. It was because the system was working exactly as designed. You reached, they had space, they regulated, they returned minus just enough to reset the cycle, just enough to give you hope, just enough to ensure the dynamic could run another loop. This is not cruelty. That's what makes it so hard to name, so hard to leave, so hard to even explain to the friends who kept asking why you stayed. It wasn't cruelty. It was an unconscious architecture built by a wounded person who never learned that intimacy doesn't have to cost them their selfhood. And you minus generous, loving, emotionally available, you minus fit perfectly into the blueprint without ever being handed the plans. Now understand what happened the day you changed, not the day you gave an ultimatum, not the day you sent the long message explaining your needs one more time, not the day you cried or begged or showed them exactly how much they mattered to you, hoping that the visibility of your love would finally move something in them. The day you stopped. The day you woke up minus, maybe after a sleepless night, maybe after a conversation with someone who finally said the thing you needed to hear, maybe in the middle of an ordinary afternoon when the exhaustion just became bigger than the hope minus and something in you quietly, permanently shifted. No announcement, no dramatic confrontation, just a decision made somewhere below conscious thought that you were done making yourself smaller to fit inside someone else's fear. That day, the system didn't just slow down. It triggered an alarm because from the avoidance nervous system perspective, something catastrophically unfamiliar just happened. The variable in the equation that was always supposed to reach minus stopped reaching. The person who was always supposed to chase minus turned around and started walking. The source of the dynamics fuel simply quietly ran dry, and suddenly they were the ones in withdrawal. Suddenly, they were refreshing the conversation. Suddenly, they were the ones lying awake, trying to decode your silence. Suddenly, the person who made an art form out of making you feel invisible started showing up in your periphery, like a ghost who forgot they were supposed to be the one doing the haunting. You watched someone who could go 3 days without texting you back suddenly find their phone and their feelings at the exact same moment. And part of you, minus the part that spent so long wanting exactly this, minus felt something complicated, something that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite grief, but lived right in between them. Because this was what you wanted. This was the version of them you always believed existed somewhere beneath the walls. But here is the thing, you have to let yourself know. This is not love awakening. This is not the breakthrough you were praying for during all those nights you rehearsed the conversation you wished you could have with them. This is not them finally seeing you for what you are. This is a control system triggering its emergency response. This is a nervous system that was built on your emotional availability, suddenly registering your absence as a threat, minus not to their heart, but to their regulation. You were not just their partner. You were, whether either of you knew it or not, a co-regulator. A stabilizing presence whose predictable need gave their unpredictable interior a reliable exterior to push against. Without your need, they have nothing to retreat from. Without your pursuit, there is no distance to create. Without your reaching, the entire mechanism that kept them feeling safe and in control has nothing to operate on. And so they move towards you for the first time, genuinely, urgently, visibly move towards you minus, and every part of your healing is going to be tested in that moment because it is going to feel like proof. It is going to feel like vindication. It is going to feel like the arrival of everything you asked for, dressed up in exactly the timing that makes it hardest to refuse. The most painful truth you will ever be asked to hold is this. They don't miss you. They miss who you were for the system. They miss the version of you that kept the architecture functional, the version that reached the version that needed. The version that needed, the version that made their withdrawal feel like power instead of fear. And you minus standing in your new wholeness, your new quiet, your new refusal to shrink minus or someone they have never actually met. When you were anxious, you were legible. That word matters more than almost anything else I could say to you minus legible. When you were spinning in the uncertainty of what they meant and what you were to them, and whether the silence was temporary or terminal, you were producing something that an avoidant attachment style knows exactly how to read. exactly how to respond to exactly how to use your anxiety, told them where you were. It told them you were still in the orbit, still invested, still willing to translate your own suffering into something patient and palatable enough that they wouldn't have to do the work of showing up. Your anxious pursuit was a constant readable signal minus, and the avoidant, whether consciously or not, oriented themselves to that signal the way a ship orients to a lighthouse, not to reach it, just to know where the rocks were. You were their bearings. So they always knew what to do with you when you were in pain, a certain amount of warmth when you pulled back, a carefully administered dose of closeness when the distance got too wide, the exact right moment to send the message that reset the clock just before you reach the actual edge. They were not manipulating you in the cinematic, calculated way that word usually implies. They were regulating minus doing what their nervous system had been trained to do since before they could name it. Managing the proximity, keeping the system viable. And you minus because you loved them, because you were generous with your interpretations, because you wanted so badly for the good moments to be the real story. Minus you kept participating. You kept reaching into the silence and pulling out just enough warmth to justify staying. But the day you healed, minus the day you actually genuinely stopped performing your pain for an audience of one who never fully watched, minus you became something their nervous system had no category for. Unreadable. Think about what that means from the inside of an avoidant attachment response. Your entire regulatory strategy depends on knowing where the other person is emotionally. You need them close enough to confirm you're wanted, far enough to confirm you're free. The anxiously attached partner is the perfect counterpart for this minus, always signaling, always visible, always providing the exact emotional data that tells the avoidant where to position themselves. And then one day that partner stops transmitting, not out of cruelty, not out of strategy, simply because they decided, minus finally, at enormous personal cost, minus that broadcasting their pain into the void was no longer something they were willing to do. From the outside, this looks like growth. It is growth. It is, in fact, one of the most profound and difficult things a human being can choose, minus to stop outsourcing their emotional safety to someone who has proven repeatedly and without ambiguity that they cannot hold it from inside the avoidant nervous system. It registers as something else entirely threat. Not the threat of losing you specifically, minus, not yet. Not in the way you might hope, minus, but the threat of disorientation, the threat of not knowing where you are, the threat of a relational map suddenly going blank in the place that used to be clearly marked. They have been reading you for however long you were together, and now the text is gone and the page is blank and their entire regulatory system is running its emergency protocol. They start reaching, and I want to be very precise about what that reaching is and what it is not, because this is the moment where so many people get pulled back in, minus, not because they're weak, not because they're foolish, but because what they're seeing looks so much like what they prayed for that it is almost impossible to hold on to the truth in the face of it. What you are witnessing is not the opening of a heart. It is the misfiring of a system. When someone who withheld from you for months, minus years, perhaps minus, suddenly becomes available, suddenly becomes expressive, suddenly starts doing all the things you begged for while you were still doing the begging. The interpretation your nervous system defaults to is, I finally reached them. My consistency paid off. My love was enough after all. That interpretation is not only wrong, it is the most dangerous story you could tell yourself. Because here is what actually happened. Your emotional independence did not teach them how to love you. It did not crack open some previously inaccessible chamber of their heart. What it did, minus what it physiologically, neurologically did, minus is remove the structure that was allowing them to avoid intimacy. It took away the mechanism they were using to stay close to. You, without being with you, your need was their exit strategy, disguised as intimacy, functioning as distance. When you removed your need, you accidentally removed their exit. And suddenly the only way to recreate the regulation they lost, minus the only way to return to the functional distance that felt like safety, minus, is to pull you close enough to push away again. They need you to need them. not because they love your neediness, but because your neediness is the raw material their attachment style requires to run. Without it, they are dysregulated in a way they cannot name, anxious in a way that feels unfamiliar and wrong, reaching for a dynamic that is no longer there and finding nothing to grab. And so they present you with something that looks from every angle like the love you wanted. Texts at hours they never texted before. Vulnerability that surfaces suddenly, unexpectedly, in ways that make you think, minus this is who they actually are. This is what they were hiding. Declarations of feeling from a person who once treated their feelings like classified information. The sudden, overwhelming, unmistakable sense that they see you now. They do see you now, but they're not seeing you the way you think. They are seeing the absence of what they needed. They are seeing the gap where your emotional availability used to be. They are seeing, for the first time, the specific shape of what your presence provided, minus, and they are experiencing its removal the way any system experiences the removal of a load-bearing wall. Everything shifts, everything feels unstable, everything moves toward the source of the disruption. Towards you, here is a sentence that will cost you something to read. An avoidant often falls the hardest for the person who stops falling for them. Not because your independence suddenly made you more attractive in some shallow strategic sense. Not because playing hard to get works, minus that framing is too small, too transactional for what this actually is. But because your wholeness, your self-possession, your quiet refusal to need them in the way they've always been needed, created in their nervous system a sensation, so foreign it mistook it for longing. What they are feeling is dysregulation. What they are calling it is love. And you minus standing in the most powerful, the most earned, the most costly version of yourself you have ever inhabited, minus are being asked to determine the difference in real time, with your history pressing against your chest. And their sudden presence making every cell in your body want to believe that this time is different. This is the moment. Not the moment you choose them or don't choose them. That's not what's at stake here. What's at stake is whether you can hold the truth long enough to make a decision from it rather than around it. The truth is this: someone's crisis is not your closure. Someone else's dysregulation is not evidence that you matter to them. Someone reaching for you in a panic is not the same as someone choosing you in clarity. You deserve to be chosen in clarity. You deserve someone who arrives before the alarm. Someone who reaches for you not because the system failed, but because they woke up one morning and understood with full presence and full choice that a life without you would simply be less than the life they wanted. That person exists. But you will never meet them minus. You will never even be available to them minus if you keep letting someone else's emergency masquerade as the love you came here for. There was a version of you that the world around you got used to, not the world in some abstract, cosmic sense, minus the specific, immediate, intimate world that you built with this person. The dynamic, the daily choreography of closeness and distance that you both, without ever signing anything, without ever sitting across from each other and negotiating terms, agreed to maintain. And in that world, you had a role. Maybe it was the one who held the emotional weight of the relationship, the one who named what was happening when they wouldn't, the one who said, I feel like we're disconnected, while they said, I don't know what you're talking about. Everything's fine. The one who stayed up turning the relationship over in your hands like a puzzle while they slept undisturbed because the puzzle was never their responsibility to solve. Maybe your role was smaller than that. Maybe it was simply the one who needed, the one whose love was slightly louder, slightly more visible, slightly more willing to sit in the discomfort of wanting something that kept being withheld, the one who reached, the one who initiated, the one who, when the silence stretched past bearable, would finally fill it minus because you could not stand the alternative and they had learned a long time before you how to live inside silence without flinching. Either way, there was a version of you minus consistent, readable, dependent in the specific ways that made the dynamic function minus that. Everyone in that orbit silently required. And when you stepped outside it, you didn't just change, you made visible what had always been true. This is what most conversations about healing miss entirely. They focus on the gain minus who you become, how much lighter you feel, the new capacity you develop for peace. And those things are real. But there's a passage between who you were and who you're becoming that no one adequately prepares you for. A passage where the people closest to you, minus the person you loved, perhaps people who orbited that relationship, perhaps even older connections that predated this one, minus begin to respond to your wholeness with something that feels uncomfortably like hostility. Not always named hostility, not always open. Sometimes it's subtle, a pulling back, a new coolness in someone who was always warm, a faint but unmistakable sense that the person who used to feel safest to you now regards your growth with something between suspicion and resentment. What happened? You stopped being useful to the story in every relational system, minus especially the ones organized around an avoidant attachment dynamic, minus every person has a function. The avoidance function is to withhold, to create the push-pull rhythm that keeps intimacy at a manageable distance. And the anxiously attached partner's function, minus your function, whether you claimed it or had it assigned to you, minus, was to pursue, to need, to remain in a state of slight emotional deficit so that the relationship always had somewhere to go without ever fully arriving. That state of deficit was not incidental to the relationship. It was the relationship. Every conversation you ever had about your needs was on some level content for a dynamic that fed on the conversation without ever resolving it. Every time you expressed vulnerability, every time you asked for more closeness, every time you laid yourself open, hoping that this would be the moment something shifted, minus you were not failing to reach them, you were providing the raw material the system required to continue. Your incompleteness was structural. So when you became complete, minus not perfect, not healed in some finished, finalized way, but genuinely, privately, quietly more whole, then you were minus the structure, had no foundation left. The dynamic that had organized itself around your emotional availability ran its request for more material and found the supply chain severed. And the response to that from someone who was built by their attachment history to treat intimacy as threat is not gratitude. It is not admiration. It is not even really aimed at you, though. It will feel personal because it will arrive through the person you loved. It is fear, dressed in 100 different costumes, minus indifference, sudden unavailability, criticism of the changes they see in you, a revisionist version of your past together that makes your healing look like abandonment, minus, but always. Underneath every costume, the same naked, unregulated fear. They don't know who to be now that you know who you are. Here is something that requires real courage to sit with. The intimacy you experienced in that relationship, minus the closeness, the connection, the moments that felt like being fully seen, minus, was not entirely false. It was real. It just wasn't free. It was intimacy delivered within very specific parameters. Intimacy that was available when you were in pain, when you were small, when you were in the kind of need that made them feel necessary and safe. Intimacy that was real but conditional in a way that was never spoken, because speaking it would have required a level of self-awareness that the avoidant attachment style, by its very architecture, is designed to avoid. The condition was never stated, but it was always present. The very self you needed to actually be loved, not loved in the performance of need, loved in the fullness of personhood. Those are not the same thing. And, minus because you felt both, or at least the ghost of both, minus that they do not feel the same. One of them leaves you hungry. An hour later, one of them actually feeds you. Now, here is the part that people in your position find hardest to hold on to, especially in the days and weeks after the dynamic starts to collapse. Your wholeness is not the problem. I want to say that again with the weight it deserves, because everything that's happening around you right now, minus the silence where warmth used to be, the withdrawal of someone who is suddenly threatened by your steadiness, the strange grief of realizing that your healing is experienced by someone else as a kind of loss, minus all of it, can start to feel like evidence that you did something wrong. You did not do something wrong. You did the hardest, most essential, most profoundly human thing there is to do. You refused to continue organizing your interior life around someone else's fear. That refusal will cost you something. It already has. It may cost you the relationship in its current form. It may cost you the version of yourself that was familiar to the people around you. It may cost you the particular comfort of being needed in the way that felt, even when it hurt, like a form of being loved. But what it purchases for you, minus what you are in the process of acquiring right now, even in the middle of the disorientation and the grief and the strange, unmoored feeling of not yet knowing who you are without the weight of someone else's walls pressing against you, minus what it purchases is something that cannot be taken back. The capacity to take up your actual space, not the space they allocated for you, not the space that the dynamic required, not the carefully managed, strategically insufficient space of almost love and conditional closeness. Your space, the full, unedited, unapologetic territory of a person who has stopped making themselves smaller to fit inside someone else's unexamined fear. You are going to feel the absence before you feel the freedom. That's not a failure of your healing. Minus, it's the texture of it. The absence is real. The grief is real. The disorientation of stepping out of a familiar dynamic, even a painful one, is completely, legitimately real. But so is this. Every single day you spend in your wholeness, minus every morning you wake up and choose not to collapse back into. The shape that the old dynamic required, minus you are building something that no one can destabilize. Not because you become invulnerable, not because you stop wanting love or connection or the particular warmth of being known by someone who chooses to keep knowing you, but because the foundation you are standing on is finally yours. And a person standing on their own foundation does not need to negotiate with someone who is threatened by their ground. You are not too much. You were never too much. You were exactly enough for a relationship that was not big enough for you. And somewhere in the life that exists on the other side of this passage, there is a love that is